Hello. Here is our mini lecture on some of the causes and compromises that contributed to the Civil War, right? And so go ahead and you're going to be getting out your notebook, and in just a moment I'll show you how to set up your page. But this is about build up to the Civil War. What were some of the causes? So a focus question that you guys are going to have to answer at the end of this, and then you're also going to have to think about, in your opinion, what were some of the biggest compromises and causes that led to the Civil War. Your focus question is, what are some of the factors, like events and people, that helped to spark the Civil War? You don't have to write that down, but just be aware that's what you're going to be asked about later on. And so this is how you're going to set up your page. All right. In fact, I think I'm going to pull up the actual image so that you're able to see it a little better. So here's the page that you need to set up in your notebook. You may want to pause the video so you can go ahead and get this down. But there are 7 questions that you're going to answer as you move throughout the video. You may want to separate it out so that you have 4 on the front of your page and 3 on the back. I just wanted to put them all on one page for you so they're easy to see. I'll go ahead and read them off, but pause the video as you need to so that you can get these down. This is the information you're going to need. So question 1, what is the definition of Civil War? Question 2, what was the Missouri Compromise? When did it happen and who was involved? MO stands for Missouri, by the way. Question 3, what was the Compromise of 1850? I want to know about the 2 biggest parts that I discuss in the video. Make sure you get those down. 2 biggest parts, or consequences, really, of the Compromise of 1850. Question 4 is, what was Uncle Tom's Cabin? I'm abbreviating it UTC. And what was the impact? Question 5, what, when, and by whom? So basically about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So what was it, when did it happen, and by whom? Who proposed this thing anyway? And then another thing I need to know about that's really important is what was the impact of the Kansas-Nebraska Act? Question 6, what, when, and involving whom? The Dred Scott case. Okay, so what was the Dred Scott case? When did it happen? And who did it involve? More than just Dred Scott. And then question 7, election of 1860. I'd like you guys to do a see, think, wonder on your page. And there's a map that I'll show you, and then also an image that's involved there. So you'll do a see, think, wonder looking at both of those pieces of media. All right? Your C should have probably at least 5 details, if not more, probably more like 7 or 8. Your think should have at least 3 or 4 different inferences based on what you see. And then wonder should be at least 2 or 3 questions that you have after looking at this. Okay, so that's what that's all about. All right. So what was the Civil War anyway? Here's the definition that you're going to need on your page. So please go ahead and you can write this down exactly as it is. When citizens of the same country take up arms, which are weapons, against each other. And that is coming from a book that I read. The author's last name is Davis, and it comes from page 117 in that book. So please go ahead and pause the video and get that down. So let's not kid ourselves. The primary reason for the Civil War, the primary cause was slavery. It was a fight over should the states be allowed to own slaves or not. And so some people will say, oh, it was about states' rights. No, it was about states' rights to own slaves or not. Okay, so the primary cause was slavery. But there were some other causes and compromises that led to the buildup as well. But this is the main one. And so this French guy, Alexis de Tocqueville, he wrote this thing called Democracy in America, where he's kind of critiquing the American system. And he said, I do not think that the white and black races will ever be brought anywhere to live on a footing of equality. But I think the matter will still be harder in the United States than anywhere else. Any intermediate measures seem to me likely to terminate shortly in the most horrible of civil wars, and perhaps in the extermination of one or the other of the two races. So, it was a pretty dire prophecy, right? But, yeah, he was right. And so, some of the tensions in the United States in the mid-1800s, here's some of the ideas that I'm going to go over in this video, all right? So we have the institution of slavery and the growing tide of abolitionism. We've been learning a lot about that. States' rights versus federal power, okay? Then we've got expansion into the West. This is a biggie, right? We learned all about westward expansion, but a big part of westward expansion, there was a big struggle over should these states be free or should they be slave states? So there's a huge battle, right? And then there were economic differences between the industrialized North that had the majority of the railroads and that kind of stuff and the factories and whatnot versus the South where all of the investments were mostly in people, right? Their money was tied up in their slaves, basically. And then the notion of popular sovereignty. You're going to hear this term like, I don't know, 3-4 billion times in this, okay, and throughout this little start to our unit. And popular sovereignty is basically when people in a state get to decide whether their state is going to be a slave state or whether it's going to be a free state. That is a major key term to be aware of. Alrighty, so here we go. I'm going to put this in present mode so you guys can see this a little bigger. Okay, so on this map up here, this line right here is where this was a major compromise that was made, okay, when Missouri was being admitted as a state into the Union. So Missouri and Maine were basically admitted at the same time in 1820, and that was a compromise, right? Maine was admitted as a free state, Missouri was admitted as a slave state. So Missouri wanted to become a state in 1818, but there's a problem because a lot of people wanted it to be a slave state. And there were 11 of each at the time. There were 11 free, there were 11 slaves, so they wanted to keep them in balance, right? Or at least the southern states did, because they were afraid that otherwise slavery would be taken away. So Henry Clay, who is this guy from Kentucky, he is a congressman from Kentucky, he comes up with this plan. And so he says, hey, let's make it so that that southern border along Missouri, anywhere south of that can be a slave state in this Louisiana territory that we've got that's still unorganized. Anywhere north of that will be a free state. But of course, Missouri is the exception because Missouri is north of its southern border, right? So it's along the 36-degree latitude line. So bloop, right there. Latitude is like a ladder going up, okay? And here's something that's interesting, though. Most people were okay with this because cotton can't grow north of this line. It needs a warmer climate. So there's that. So get down what you need to answer your question. What was the Missouri Compromise, right? Who was involved? What's it all about? And then take a look at this little key over here and study this. Okay, Compromise of 1850. So again, we got Henry Clay. Now this is 30 years later, all right? In this compromise, there are a few key components. But the main question is, would slavery be allowed in this new territory? Okay? That was acquired from Mexico. So there's 5 acts that are bundled together. One is that you're going to have the abolition of the slave trade in Washington, D.C., nation's capital. That's real classy, right? Then you're going to have California admitted as a free state. Then New Mexico and Utah were open for settlement, and the notion of popular sovereignty would allow settlers to decide, is it going to be a free state or a slave state? They would get to vote. Of course, it's just white men who are voting for this, so, right? Then Texas would become a slave state, and they would get $10 million to help them with their debt, like their war debt and all kinds of stuff. Okay, so I guess they came into the United States and they were a tad bit broke. And then you have the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, okay, where escaped slaves would be returned pretty much no matter what. Like anyone who helped a slave could be prosecuted and put in jail for like 6 months and be given a huge fine or whatever. But basically also every single person who was suspecting that someone else might be a slave, they had to act upon it and turn that suspected slave in. But guess what? It only took one person to accuse an African American of being a slave, and then they could be sent back down into slavery. Crazy, huh? All right, and like most compromises, nobody was really happy about this. These two maps show the before the compromise, right? And then after the compromise. So you have California being admitted as a free state. Texas trades some territorial claims for debt relief, so there's a little more division going on in here. And then New Mexico becomes the New Mexico Territory with slavery undecided. It would be up to popular sovereignty. So two things to be aware of, right? Two major things. Popular sovereignty. So states, new states getting to determine whether they're free or slave. And then the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. Those are the two biggest parts of the Compromise of 1850. And keep in mind, this kind of does away with the Missouri Compromise of 1820, right? Which said, so anywhere north of this line right here would not be allowed to be a slave state. Anywhere south of that could be. But, yeah, it kind of throws things up in the air. So then we have Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin was a book that was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. We've heard about her before. It was published in 1852 in March. And basically, her sister encouraged her to write a story that would make people really feel deeply about how terrible slavery was. And it worked. Harriet Beecher Stowe's father, her father was an abolitionist who sent rifles. They were called Beecher's Bibles. Okay, so he sent these boxes of rifles to the Free Soilers and abolitionists in Kansas after the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. You're going to hear about that in just a minute. So, and then later on, after Uncle Tom's Cabin exploded onto the scene and sold 300,000 copies by the first year of publication, or within the first year, Abraham Lincoln met her later on and said, so you're the one who's kind of responsible for starting this great war. All right, the little woman part is a little bit condescending, but whatever. I guess in comparison to him, pretty much everybody was little because he was extremely tall. Now, with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, this was enacted in 1854. And so take a look at this map here. Look at where the Missouri Compromise line was, right? So no states north of this boundary line here were supposed to become slave states. However, what this act does is it overturns the Missouri Compromise because Stephen Douglas from Illinois, a senator, he's the one who kind of sponsors this bill and pushes it forward. And basically, his proposal is that each new territory gets to decide its own fate. Is it going to be slave or is it going to be free? And the settlers get to make the decision through popular sovereignty. Okay? So basically, his act would divide Kansas and Nebraska territory into two parts. His reasons for wanting to do this is because if this territory became more established and was on its way to statehood, then he could build, or he could have the Transcontinental Railroad go through his home state of Illinois, which would bring in major business, and then it would have somewhere structured to go through, which was kind of required, okay, all the way through to California. And so he wasn't wanting to take a position on the slave state, free state thing, so he said, hey, just let the people decide through popular sovereignty. And this is when free soilers who were opposed to slavery streamed into Kansas. And this is when border ruffians from Missouri, they also went into Kansas, both with the intent of making it fit their viewpoint, whether it was to be a free state or a slave state. John Brown showed up too. We know him, major abolitionist, with his sons, and he commits that massacre at Pottawatomie Creek. And Kansas thenceforth becomes known as Bleeding Kansas because of all the bloodshed going on and the fight over slavery. Okay, the Dred Scott case. This is a major Supreme Court decision that was made. Roger Taney was the Supreme Court justice at the time who rules that Dred Scott can be taken by his master into free states and free territories and still be considered a slave. All right? So that was the major finding. You can pause the video and kind of read this over. It would be a good idea for you to do so. So final step here, guys, with your notes on your page is you need to do a See, Think, Wonder based on this map of the election of 1860, and then also factoring in the information that's up here in this graphic. Notice that Lincoln, of course, the winner, He is color-coded in red. All right, so make some observations that you see here and make sure to write them down on your page.